Hello and welcome to the Energy Talk podcast. My name is Olubumi Olajide and thank you for joining us again this week. Today we're going to talk about energy in California, specifically focusing around the wildfires that happened there around September, and we're going to be talking also about the utilities. So we have a representative from PG&E, and just a quick disclaimer, he's speaking as an individual and he isn't representing PG&E, so the views he gives and the answers he gives to the questions very much represent his own point of view and not necessarily the point of view for PG&E. So just a quick disclaimer to just throw that out there. And also another piece of information that will be probably very important to the conversation is this interview was recorded on the 11th of September. So that can just give some context of the information that was shared and what the timeline were in the control of the wildfires and how that was affecting the region at the time. So let's jump into the conversation and learn about the utility sector and the wildfires effects in California. I hope you enjoyed this interview.
So my name is Shawn Adderly, and I am a Chief of Staff and Principal for major projects and programs at Pacific Gas and Electric. So in my job, I'm basically responsible for executing strategic initiatives, increasing our organization's maturity in data science, looking over performance management, advising the Vice President and Senior Management team on important matters. But my organization essentially looks at our long-term grid resiliency programs and also other initiatives that we're driving to deliver safe and reliable electricity to our customers. I've been in the energy industry for a little bit over 5 years. I came into it in an interesting way. I started my career in semiconductor manufacturing at IBM. And while I was going to grad school at night at the University of Vermont when I lived in Burlington, I actually decided to get a master's degree in statistics. I have an undergraduate in electrical engineering from the University of Illinois Urbana, and I decided that it's good to pivot my career towards energy because I just saw opportunity on pretty much every continent and something that is vital to society. And so I did research in the smart grid arena, and that led me to PG&E when someone read my thesis on smart grid investment and the benefits that we've seen in reliability.
That's actually very interesting. And I want to go into that a bit, but we were supposed to have this conversation yesterday for you. And we couldn't have this conversation yesterday. So I think, could you go over the reason why we couldn't have this conversation earlier? And I think that can give a good preface to what we're going to talk about today.
Oh, absolutely. So yesterday I was busy looking after our response to a recent power shutoff event that we conducted to basically reduce the risk from a catastrophic wildfire occurring from one of the distribution or transmission lines that are in our service territory. And so really, when you have an event like that, it impacts, anywhere from a couple thousand to even we came close to impacting, I think, up to 1 million customers, if not more in last year's events. And really, requires focus and trying to figure out the strategy to figure out where you need to de-energize and then also determine how you're going to restore customers once you have the all clear, which really is you have wind speeds that are below a certain level that you now believe that you no longer will have risk to your electric assets. And at that point, we would deploy the team. And so during that time, I was trying to identify, where the resources in our system that are able to basically go patrol the lines and then, identify any damage that may exist and then go from there in terms of letting the control center know that it's safe to re-energize those lines.
And wildfires is something that's pretty common in the area that you're in, but it's become a lot more frequent. So could you go over some of the reasons you think that this is something that's become a lot more of an issue and how it's interconnected with the utility PG&E that you currently work for?
So over the last 2 decades, we've seen increasing wildfire events that naturally occur primarily due to climate change and other factors that have to do with the drought in the state of California. So California as a state, has had several years of drought, which has really led to dying vegetation and a much drier environment where, combined with low humidity, high wind speeds, not only do you have natural fires, but then there's a possibility that those wind speeds could actually impact electric lines and cause them to fail, which when they break, they essentially have the opportunity to spark and cause an ignition, which is why PG&E and the other utilities in the state of California came up with a public safety power shutoff program to mitigate that risk.
And I can imagine the power shutoffs aren't very popular among the clients that PG&E serves.
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, honestly, I don't think anyone is a fan of any time power goes out for any reason, but we firmly believe that this is necessary to keep our customers safe, and it's also something that the other two utilities in the states, large investor-owned utilities, SDG&E and SoCal Edison, are also implementing. I think it's the challenge is also making sure that people have adequate time to prepare, and then looking after any customers that may need additional support because they're on oxygen or something else that requires electricity. So we really try to go out of our way to make sure that all of our customers are notified with adequate time if possible. These events do change, and sometimes weather conditions change faster than you can react to. So we do our best and just try to keep the communication lines open and restore customers as fast as we can. And I think on that, we're also taking long-term strategies to harden our system so that we would reduce the possibility of a line causing ignition. We've been enhancing our inspections pretty rapidly, trying to essentially identify issues with any of our assets and fixing them so that they don't cause a problem, whether it be an outage that just, routinely impacts customers, or something larger, right, that turns into a large wildfire event. So we've been taking precautions there, and we're also, evaluating certain technologies such as, microgrids, and looking at ways that we can actually de-energize lines before they hit the ground. So there's a lot of things that we're doing to hopefully mitigate the future impact of PSPS events.
And I think this is a good point to kind of transition to your earlier point. You mentioned that you went back to graduate school, you wrote a thesis that originally got you into the industry. So what was that about? And then we can go on to talk about more of the technologies. I just want to go over what was the thesis that you wrote, and what was your initial interest in the utility sector, and is this what you imagined dealing with when you originally got involved?
Yeah. So what really drove my interest in writing the thesis was that I had noticed that a lot of people had mentioned in literature and articles that the United States grid is fairly old, and that we really needed to improve the technological capabilities of the system. And I wondered, did we see a benefit from the large investment that we're making into increasing that technological capability? So in essence, are we seeing a reduction in outages? Are we seeing shorter durations that customers spend without power after an outage event? And so I was really interested in that question. And so my advisor had actually done some work on large blackout events in the United States, and I wanted to see if those events were increasing or decreasing over time with the new smart grid stuff that's been implemented. And I did notice, right, that we're seeing a decrease in the duration of outages, and we're also seeing a decrease in some of the frequencies of outages, just because we're able to actually convert things that would have been a sustained outage over to a momentary, using things like trip savers, which essentially allow it to clear the line without someone having to go out into the field and then manually reset a switch. So that was really interesting to me. And then just going into the industry, I did not expect to be working on wildfire mitigations. To be honest with you, I actually started in the natural gas piece of PG&E, and primarily it was a way to get into the company, and I planned to transition to electric operations, which I did after a year. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the system risk and looking at data and trying to develop, an asset replacement plan, which I spent a lot of time in the substation realm looking at, why do things fail and how do we predict failure so that we could then, prioritize our investment strategy that aligns to, minimizing outages for our customers and making sure there's no large outage events at the substation level, and had not ever foreseen that I would be working mostly on wildfire related things, to be honest with you.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting cycle you've gone through because I guess I should give a background about myself. So I'm from Nigeria, and that's a part of the world. I think most African countries fall into this category where power outages are more of a way of life than they are a rare occurrence. So there's a different way we see utilities playing, and right now there's a lot of efforts being made in a lot of different developing countries to develop out their grids. And now going back to what you mentioned before about smart grids and about decentralized grids, I think many of the listeners might not really understand what those things are. So I think we should take some time to talk about how the grid works in the region you're in, and is it something that needs to be updated? Is it something that is good as it is, and how is it going to adapt into the future?
Yeah, great question. And so I will say one thing about Nigeria, and so it's really interesting to me, right? Looking at a large portion of the world, including Nigeria, that sometimes faces several day outages, and it's fairly common. And in fact, I remember reading an article even in 2009, the presidential palace in Nigeria was not spared from a power outage. So it's certainly something that in the rest of the world, to a certain extent, in some of the developing countries, or even some non-developing countries where it's been pretty constant in terms of having large-scale outages. And so any amount of time in the United States seems to be too much. And it's interesting because we've had pretty good reliability in the United States over the last few decades, even though there's been a couple large events here and there, most notably the Northeast blackout in the early 2000s. But, looking at how the grid's evolving, traditionally in most electric systems, power flows in one direction. So you go from a generator, right, like a generation plant, whether it be, nuclear, gas, coal, etc., and then that moves its way through, right, a transmission system that then, steps down at a substation, to more of a distribution side, and then there's further step downs with transformers on the line, and then that pretty much goes to the end customers. And that's really been the way the utilities industry has been set up for probably the last 100 years, right? I mean, that has been the most efficient way to transport electricity from A to B. What we found in the last few years, right, with the availability of solar panels that you can basically put on any structure that has the space, or even on the ground next to a structure, or in a remote location, and pulling back with a transmission line to a certain swath of areas, right? You can now take advantage of sort of having more a distributed nature, right? So instead of having a centralized nature, you can have a distributed nature where power really can flow in both directions. And that allows us to basically have this opportunity where you don't necessarily have to build more large plants. You can now, let's say, put solar panels on everyone's home, and then actually have power flow back right into the system and move to where it's needed. And so obviously, right, the electric system was not designed to accommodate widespread distributed generation and the two-way flow of power. So we definitely see some challenges with that, right, when it comes to making sure that voltage stays within the regulated limits, like coordinating with protection devices, which are essentially things on the line that ensure that you're staying inside the proper operating conditions. Otherwise, you have to isolate that section or open it to protect the assets down the line. And so it's definitely changed the way that we have to look at our system.
And right now, with climate change, obviously, and renewable energy sources coming into the mix, as you mentioned, uh, this is something that's become a lot more of a conversation topic, especially when you go to developing nations, because in a state like California and in a country like the USA, you're kind of looking back a bit retrospectively because you already have a grid that relatively works very, very well. But reversing back to Nigeria that I mentioned before, we're still in a stage where a lot of the country isn't still connected very well by a central grid. And now that decentralized grids are become more popular with renewable energy as the main source of power generation, now it's a question of, do we just look at the way the grid has been set over the last few years, and does it need a major overhaul with these two major factors, climate change and renewable energy playing in the mix? So, what view do you see of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly there has to be certain upgrades at substations. There might be having necessary upgrades to the capacity of the system and some of the devices that monitor and sense, the loading on the system. There's been the need for a lot more current sensors and other devices that give us a sense of the loading, smart meters, and other current sensing technologies, just to see how things are in situ. So I would say there are some potential capacity upgrades that need to happen. Especially if you're moving power in an area that you previously did not have a large amount of generation. So feeder constraints are an issue, but you don't necessarily have to rebuild the grid. I just think it's definitely very selective upgrades in certain areas to allow for the two-way flow. And then also looking at the system when it comes to climate change, right? I mean, I think you look at the location of substations. Some are near bodies of water. Others are, maybe not as high as they need to be, based on where the predicted sea level rise is going to then, potentially flood that substation in the future. Additionally, you have assets that, particularly in the United States, there's a lot of old assets in our system, and we need to definitely change out certain things that would be susceptible to high temperatures. In high temperatures, lines tend to sag because they are a conductor, and they tend to, basically sag down. And, as high temperatures continue to increase, we're going to have to look at, potentially taking some strategies, whether it be changing the clearance requirements between, the top of the bottom of the line to the street level, or looking at even covered conductor for some places where there's trees, underbrush. We have to definitely look at some considerations for preventing our system from failing because of increased temperatures, flooding, and other natural disasters that may come up as a result of climate change.
And just speaking about this current issue, what are the major issues that have been identified in just from the perspective of PG&E, from the utility perspective? What are the main challenges that have been identified as of right now that are points for improvement?
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think the major thing, right, is ensuring that we are well, one, maintaining the vegetation management, footprint around our assets, and two, using technologies to determine failures before they occur due to, let's say, high temperatures. And then also, we're putting covered conductor throughout our service territory in Tier 3, which is a high fire threat district area, to prevent ignitions. And so, I mean, that's that. And then also we're looking at ways to further sectionalize the system so that, we can definitely have more microgrids and smaller footprints for PSPS as a result of climate change. If we think our assets are susceptible at risk of failure.
What is up? Yes, that you mentioned.
Public safety power shutoff. So those are some of the things. I mean, certainly we've been looking at our assets long term and figuring out what makes sense in terms of where we may need to make some strategic investments. So those things are underway, and over the next several years, we're going to be looking at, what actions do we need to take, in additional to the ones that I mentioned, really to mitigate our customers against the risk of climate change. But certainly something on our agenda, I think a little bit more so than other parts of the United States, just given the drought and the extreme fires that we saw.
And since everything is kind of happening all at once, it might seem like that. I just wanted to take a step back right now. What exactly are the generation sources that PG&E in California currently uses? Because you mentioned nuclear, but I think I read some reports that there was a nuclear plant that was at risk of being shut down. I know there's a lot of conversation around what exactly generation sources, and a lot more focus on it. So, can you just give a picture about what it looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, overwhelmingly, right, in California, we have a pretty good amount of renewables on our system. So, I mean, I'm going to reference back to 2017, which is one that I have in my head in terms of what our power mix looked like. So, 2017, PG&E's power mix had a roughly 33% renewable, 27% nuclear, 18% large hydro, 20% natural gas plus some other fuels, and then roughly about 2% were market purchases. So you just mentioned about Diablo Canyon, so which is PG&E's power plant, or nuclear power plant that's located in San Luis Obispo. And yes, we are looking at taking that plant offline in a couple years, and that generation is going to have to be now met with other parts of the power mix. And renewables, right, is the thing that we're pushing towards. And you may be aware, right, California is moving towards getting to 100% renewable energy in the next couple decades. So that is a bit of a challenge, but nuclear power has not necessarily been really popular in the state of California. Diablo Canyon has had a perfect operating record throughout time, has had no major incidents, but certainly that contributes a good deal of our energy that's going to have to be now moved over to renewables. And then battery storage is also going to have to really come up to speed here to be able to store the excess generation from the renewables so that we can use that at night to power our customers.
And I don't know if you'll be willing to share, but what are the major drivers behind a technology like nuclear not being as popular? Is it a financial decision to phase out that technology? Is it a policy driven decision? Just give us a better understanding on why that decision is being made.
Yeah, I mean, giving you my personal opinion on that, I mean, it's a confluence of all of those factors. I think that to me, policy is the number one driver in the state of California. But then beyond that, I think there's also some questions about looking at the cost, per kilowatt hour when you're operating a nuclear plant versus a solar plant, and then other incentives that might come with putting on more solar resources. But I mean, Diablo is the last nuclear power plant in the state of California, and given this is a state that has a lot of seismic activity and other natural disasters, I think it makes sense to move away from something like nuclear. But obviously that's a personal opinion. But I think there's definitely some huge plus sides to nuclear. Right, it's safe. It's been proven safe. It's reliable energy, and it makes a good percentage of the base load.
Moving forward, as you said, the goal is to get to 100% renewable energy. Just talk about this goal. Is it something that is immediately practical with the technology on hand? Is it something that can immediately go into effect, and how would that affect the grid in just in general?
Yeah. So I think it is possible, right, with the technology. it's going to impact the grid in the sense that we really need to then speed up the transition of some of the generating sources that are mostly natural gas. Start phasing out those power plants faster. But there's really no convincing evidence that it's not unfeasible. It's just a matter of, I think, having the time to be able to ramp up and bring on enough battery storage, bring on enough renewables, and then really, right, if we're still operating from a somewhat of a centralized grid premise, you're just basically replacing the fossil fuel plants with the solar fields, and you're then adding the battery storage. And I think the challenge is going to be, can you do it in a couple decades, and are you going to be able to just deploy all those assets, by when the state of California is looking at implementing 100%?
I think this is a perfect time to talk about it, because another report that I read recently was that people having their own solar home systems is becoming more and more popular in that area. And how does this affect going forward? Because I heard something that it sounds very, very strange to me, that people can actually sell the power they generate from their own homes back to the grid system. And as someone from Nigeria, this sounds like like, how does that even happen? So could you just walk us through how people's personal decisions and household decisions are going to affect how the grid kind of adapts in the future, and how this power distribution works?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I would say definitely what we see in our service territory and probably throughout the United States is that, right, social economic status tends to determine whether you have the ability to purchase solar, panels and potentially battery storage for your home. And that's I think the number one driver. The second driver has really been some subsidies that have enabled folks. There was a federal tax credit that provided some benefits for implementing solar. And there's certain credit programs in the state of California that give you incentives for putting on panels. And so interestingly enough, right, over 40 states in the country allow for some type of net metering. And what I mean by net metering is that you're able to actually install panels and then sell back to the utility provider. And that actually ties in really well with the strategy of going to a more distributed system, because essentially, right, households generate energy for their use, and what they don't use beyond that, right, that energy now gets fed back through the grid. So your meter typically only reads one way, but you actually get a meter that reads both ways. So it reads the amount of energy coming in, and it reads the amount of energy going out. And you can basically receive checks, right, from the power company for the excess energy that you've sent to the grid. And I think that looking at Nigeria as an example, I mean, you can think of just imagine one person who has excess capacity that builds like 3 times the amount of panels, beyond their demand in terms of energy, and they can sell back, right, to other to the utility company, help reduce that burden from the power generators that exists, and really moves us towards having a system where electricity doesn't have to travel across long distances. So I think it's back to some of those questions of like, okay, the grid topology can change. Maybe you don't need a large interconnected system in some places, or maybe you only need to rely on the interconnection when you have a failure, right, in certain parts of the system. So it allows for a lot more ability to have flexibility.
Okay. And we spoke earlier about the wildfires. Obviously, it's not a past conversation. It's still something that's very much still an issue. What ways are you looking at dealing with it? Because I'm sure this is not going to be the last time something like this will probably happen. As we know, the effects of climate change have a very way of adding on to themselves, and this might be something that might become a lot more frequent than it is right now. And you never know just how dire the situations might be. So Long term, what are you thinking personally, and then you can give maybe from PG&E's point of view.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think, what I'm thinking is, right, we need to evaluate, how you can reduce long spans running through highly forested areas, right, that have a high likelihood of where ignition could happen. Need to think about, how to reduce the cost of undergrounding. So you can put some lines, underground and remove that risk from an overhead line coming in contact with a tree branch, or failing, due to high speed winds. I think also, right, we're gonna have to think about relocating assets potentially, and then looking at ways to, I would say personally, look at disconnecting people from the grid if possible. I think one of the challenges is that utilities typically have an obligation to serve. So I always use this example. So I mean, if you're Comcast or another similar provider, um, they don't necessarily have to provide service for broadband, right? There's other avenues as to how that would be, provided to you. There could be a satellite, service that beams in. There could be the new SpaceX, Starlink satellite system that you can, capture, your broadband from. But a utility really has an obligation to serve. So having that obligation, you need to technically be able to provide reliable electricity to everyone. And, we're just faced with that challenge. So, being able to say, hey, I can just rip up some lines that are in a high risk area and give you a solar system and a battery storage and basically island you is not necessarily a option.
And speaking of that, because I think that's also a very interesting point, have you had any interesting conversations? Because I'm sure right now that PG&E is in the news a lot. Have you had any conversations with just people who don't really understand how the grid works? And to be fair, it is a very complicated topic to kind of get into. So, have you had any interesting conversations that have kind of like spun into different angles? And what do you wish people knew more about? Because obviously, it's very difficult to explain to all the important points in just one conversation. But what do you wish people knew about the grid and knew about the way electricity is generated and distributed that you think would make both ends a lot easier in terms of understanding the limitations and the challenges, and also like having good standards for future service delivery?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, the thing that I've actually spoken to customers and a couple focus groups here in the last couple of months, and just trying to understand their experience, right, as they're going through a power shut off that's necessitated to reduce risk, and understanding some of the things that they wish they knew more about. And one of the things that I notice is that um, we don't really see that people have an understanding of exactly why the system was designed the way it was. And looking at the state of California, where things are really spread out, and in the United States in general, right, you see a large percentage of overhead power lines. And people haven't realized that our system has essentially just kept growing from the original system that was built, right, over 100 years ago. And trying to explain that you can't actually really change a system like that overnight. You can't just underground 80,000 line miles in a couple weeks, right? It really takes a couple of decades, right, to do something like that. And so really helping people understand it's an iterative process, and that it requires really buy-in, not only from the utility, but also from the regulators. So utilities earn typically a regulated return of investment, rate of return on their investments, and they're really building and replacing infrastructure based on the needs for the customer. So if you replace too much assets, then the customers end up paying a really large amount for electricity. So the ideal situation is like you really prioritize and hopefully capture everything that you need to do over a couple of years, and then go ahead and address those things. And that has been, I think, a challenge for me to explain to people. Utilities don't make more money if you use more energy. It doesn't work that way. It's really trying to fund maintaining a system so that everyone benefits from it. And that's one thing I wish people understood a bit more about it, and just trying to think about that and realize that utility bills are pretty constant, right? They tend to track with the rate of inflation in the United States in general, right? And for U.S. utilities, and that's far better than some of the other services that you can procure out there for other things in the communication space, or even technology.
Your career has kind of moved along the path of, I would say, curiosity and necessity at this point. What is next for you? What challenges are you looking forward to, and what new places do you see a need for you to kind of come in and learn and start to exercise yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the number one challenge I see is having a quantitative background is that, we really need to figure out how we can use data analytics to better drive decision making. And what I mean by that is, I've seen a lot of startups, right, claim that they can come in, look at all of our data, or look at other utilities' data and tell you exactly what you need to replace and, what you should be focusing on. And it's not that simple. The systems were not designed to be analyzed, right? Like they took information in. They didn't necessarily take all the information that you needed to come to a very analytical decision. A lot of things, right, had to do with subject matter expertise plus, the available data. And so, what I really would like to focus on is figuring out, how we can build new data systems that actually capture the information that's necessary to make those decisions about, what asset investments we need to make and what upgrades to the system we need to take. And I think the other thing that really I'm spending a lot of time on too is thinking about how you can automate more things. So I use the example of the control centers. So a couple decades ago, you had probably 3 times as many people as you do now inside of a distribution control center or a transmission control center. And it's primarily because you've automated a lot of processes where computers can respond faster to opening switches and diverting the flow of power if you have a line that's taken out of service for some reason, or if you're trying to restore power, looking at how can you get drones to go out there and look at the situation and report back so that you don't have to make 2 trips to the site. You can assess the situation, decide what you need, and then actually send your crew out there and remediate it and reduce the impact to the customer. So I think looking at how you can leverage things like artificial intelligence and automation, and really build up a robust data analytics platform.
Thank you for joining us on this episode, and thank you, Shawn, for making the time for this conversation, especially during the time period where we did record this. Thank you for being on the show, and I hope you learned something as well. California is always a good case study for designing energy systems and response to climate accelerated disaster. So that was always something very interesting to read about, and I hope you learned new things from this interview particularly. So I just want to thank you all for making time for this, and also a few of you have been reaching out to me via LinkedIn. I really want to say it's always great to get to know the people who listen to the podcast, and I encourage you, because we have returning listeners every single week, just reach out to us. I'm very curious kind of people who listen to the podcast, and it's very interesting that a lot of you are doing very interesting things and from interesting parts of the world. So don't be shy, reach out to us. Reach out to me personally on LinkedIn, or reach out to us on our social media pages on Twitter or Instagram at The Energy Talk everywhere, or email us. We'll be glad to hear from you. And also, if you have any episode ideas that you want us to explore, any things that you want us to consider, we're very open to feedback. So with that being said, I just want to say that don't forget to subscribe to the podcast if you aren't already. Leave us a rating or review if you're on Apple Podcasts. It helps out a lot. And if you want to help out even more, please share the episode with a colleague or a friend. And don't forget, we'll be back again next week with another episode, and I hope you join us for that. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye-bye.